we're going to talk about bears, skunks, and Procyanidea and tree dweller tracks. So that's a fancy name for a lot of species that have a lot of commonality between them. Okay. And really what we're talking about, they have similar track features between all of them. And so I group them together, even though they're not all in the same family. Okay. So Procyanidea is raccoons, coatis, ringtails, a couple other species in there as well. But again, I like grouping them together because when you learn one species or family, you can kind of use the same principles to look at the other ones. So let's get started, and we're going to start with bear tracks. Okay. So bear tracks, when we look at those characteristics, we're going to see that they have the same features generally as these other species we just talked about: skunks, raccoons, coatis, and ringtails. And the first thing we're going to note is their tracks are what's called plantigrade. Okay, so actually, if we look up here, and actually this may not be the best photo to show this, but we have a bear track at the top, a skunk below, and a raccoon below it. What plantigrade means is just a fancy way for saying that the toes, the palm pad, which is the fleshy part of the track, and you can look at your hand or foot, and the heel pad all reliably register for these species. Not all the time, but most of the time. And that's different from, let's say, canines or deer, who may only show, in the case of deer, only their toes, or canines or felines who only show, let's say, the heel pad. Okay. And so when that happens, when we see a whole foot that registers like this, then we generally know, okay, that that's going to be one of these species if it's a mammal. Okay. So one of the other things is that there are 5 toes that register reliably on the front feet and the hind feet. Okay, we almost always see that, with one exception, which we're going to talk at the end here with some other species we're going to deal with. But with bears, skunks, and raccoons, that's always the case. And we're usually going to see nails, not always. It depends on the species, but they're always present. And so if you have deep substrate, a lot of times you're usually going to see that register. They're all tree climbers. Okay, that's one of the great things is that to know is that all of these species, you can group them together with the exception of skunks. They're going to spend at least some of their time in trees. And why I like them so much too is that they all resemble very much a human anatomy in terms of their what we would refer to as our hands and feet, more so than any other mammal track. Again, there's differences, of course, but that makes them easy to recognize and for us to relate to by looking at the bottom of your feet, okay, or your hands. And their primary gaits are going to be walks and lopes. Okay, so in this particular case, when you see these animals, they're going to be doing a walk on 4 feet rather than 2 feet, and you're going to see them utilize something which is a lope. And basically, if you're a horse person, it's similar to a canter, but it's what's called a grouped gait. Okay, and there'll be another session on discussing gaits and why that's so important. So let's start off with the American black bear. Okay, so the black bear track, first of all, has very wide palm pads, and you can see the front foot at the top here, as well as the hind foot below it. In both cases, it has a very wide palm pad, if you can see my cursor here. And we also see on both of them 5 toes, which form basically a little arc around the top. There's some curvature here, okay? And on the hind foot as well, not quite as much on the hind foot, not as much curvature, but there's still some. And they're also, if we drew a line right down the middle of the track, and basically bisected it, we would see it's slightly asymmetrical. Okay, the left side doesn't quite line up to the right side. And one of the main reasons for that is because bears have this low toe, okay, on the inside of the track. The other thing is the palm pad, it's curved again on the top, and it's going to be wider on the outside part of the track. It's a little harder to tell in this one, but particularly on the front track. And this is common among many of these species. It basically gets larger on the outside of the track. They also have very large but blunt nails, and we can see one registering right here. They show up in deep substrate. Okay, they don't always register again. And between the toes and the pad, the part that doesn't register, make an impression on the ground, is what we typically refer to as the negative space. Black bears have a lot of fur filled in there. So in certain substrates, you might even be able to see it here. You can actually see little hair marks between them. Okay. Again, I mentioned earlier, they have a low toe. We refer to that as toe one. It's the inside toe. It means it's toward the midline of the animal. So in this case here, these would both be right feet because the low toe is on the inside on the left side. And that's very different from humans. I spoke about earlier how these are, you can look at these, kind of similar if you want to look at this bottom hind track to our feet. But the key difference is that we have a big toe, which is not a low toe. It's either the highest toe or close to the second highest in humans, right? It's very different with bears. And obviously the reason for us is that we walk exclusively on 2 feet. Bears typically are most of the time on 4 feet. And so it also makes it easier. One of the theories is that this low toe, when they're climbing trees, to wrap around a tree trunk or a branch and give them better grip. The hind track is larger than the front track. And one of the main reasons for that also is because the heel pad shows. And you can see it here. This is a really not a perfect track, but you can see this heel pad showing here, and you can see the line of demarcation between the palm pad just above it and the heel pad below it. In the front track, they typically don't have a heel pad that shows. When it does, it's just a round dot. It's actually a little bitty circle, and it's well below the palm pad. Okay, it's not connected. And again, in the hind track, the heel pad is almost always going to show up. And their preferred gait is what's known as an overstep walk, and that's just a fancy way for saying that the hind foot is going to land in front of the front foot where the front foot landed. Typically, there's exceptions to this always, but that's a very it's key to one, understanding behavior, but also trying to differentiate between species. Okay, let's look at a closely related species now. Brown bears are what we refer to in North America as grizzly bears. They also have very wide palm pads, again, 5 toes. One of the differences, though, is that, and it's a little hard to see here, but there's less curvature in their toes across the top. They're more in a line. And you can see this low toe on the inside is not as far down as it is in black bears. So that's one of the ways to distinguish between them. The palm pad is again curved on the top and wider on the outside, just as it is with black bears. Okay. And they also have very large blunt nails. They register in most cases if you have deep substrate, and also they have less fur, so you're not likely to see that in the negative space between the toes and the palm pad. That's not going to show up as much. Again, as I mentioned before, there is a low toe. It's not quite as low, but it's on the inside of the track. Again, very different from humans. And as with black bears, the hind track is larger than the front track. Okay, and again, that's largely due to this heel pad registering. Okay, whereas in the front track, again, it just has that round dot, and a lot of times, most of the time, that doesn't show up. And then again, just as with black bears, their preferred gait is an overstep walk. Okay, so very similar, just a couple of key differences, and really it's with those toes being in a line. So let's compare both of those with polar bear tracks. Okay, overall, again, they're very similar. They have 5 toes. They form an arc around the top of the track. Again, this is a front at the top of this picture and a hind below. However, they're very wide tracks. Okay, and one of the reasons they're wide is because, again, they have so much weight to support. And you can imagine, particularly walking on ice and snow, it can be very thin ice at times. They need to support that weight. And so the larger foot can spread the weight out over a larger surface area. Okay. The palm pad is again curved and wider on the outside, just like the other bear species. And they also have large blunt nails, but they may not show. Okay. And as you can imagine, they have lots of fur living in very cold climates. So between the negative space, between the toes and the pad, there's a lot of fur. And if you happen to get a really clean register on snow, you might be able to see that. As with the other bear species, again, the low toe, unlike human feet, is going to be on the inside. Okay, and that's going to tell you that, again, in this case, down here, this is, you can see it clearly. This is a right track. Okay, up here, this is going to be a left front. Okay, and the hind track is actually, again, it's going to be larger than the front track, but it's also wider than it is long. And again, that's due to that really long, really big palm pad to support that weight. So the width of it's going to be greater than the length of that track. Okay. The heel pad on the front track, again, is this small dot, and you can actually see a little bit of it right here. It's just this little round, looks almost like a perfect circle. And maybe not in this particular registration, but oftentimes, and it's separated from the palm pad. Whereas in the hind foot, the heel reliably registers and it basically merges with the palm pad. You can see maybe a little line of demarcation here, but it almost looks like one contiguous pad. And again, their preferred gait is an overstep walk where the hind foot would land just in front of the front foot. Let's talk now just a little bit about other bear sign and their behaviors. So their scat, and I'm focusing almost exclusively now on black and brown bears because that's what most people are going to see. They, unlike polar bears, they are omnivores and they'll eat all kinds of vegetable matter as well as meat. Okay. And when they are eating fruit and vegetable matter, you're going to see their scats are going to be more tubular like humans, maybe somewhat loose, and maybe at times amorphous with no shape or kind of falls apart. Whereas if they've been feeding on an animal, whether deceased or they made a kill, they're going to be more of these loose patties, okay? And you can think more like a cow scat, if you will, or bovine scat, okay? So you can, and I've seen both. It's very common, and you might, if you didn't know better, you'd think it was a different animal, but it really just has to do with their diet, okay? In terms of where they sleep or den, they use a variety of locations. So, you can find them under trees or under roots. They'll even dig holes, obviously caves. Again, this depends a lot on the local environment and ecology. Some bears, particularly in the more southern climates, won't hibernate, but it's very common if you're looking for them. I'm not advocating that you do, but that's where you're going to find them. Okay. They also are very easy to find sign for. Again, they're very large animals, and they're kind of our elephants of North America, if you will. And so they tear up a lot of things, right? They eat a lot, so there's a lot of browse that you can find. They tear up logs. They dig for food. They'll break apart tree limbs, looking for various grubs. Just basically whatever they can find, as well as, again, feeding on vegetable matter, fruit, mast, acorns, you name it. Okay. One of the things that's really interesting about bears is when they are up in trees and they're feeding, they'll create what's called a bear nest. And again, because of their weight, they're not going to go out on really tiny limbs, and also just to save energy. So what they'll do is they'll get in one part of the tree, typically the kind of a center part of it, and they'll reach out on these limbs and they'll snap them back and fold them back towards them to get to whatever they're trying to get to. And, in many cases, it's acorns, right? So if it's an oak tree, they'll snap those limbs, fold them back, and they'll do that in every direction. And so when it finished, basically what it looks like is this giant squirrel's nest, okay, that's been folded in. And a lot of deciduous trees, what will happen is if their branches are broken off during the growing season, when it comes fall, and normally, the leaves would fall off, those leaves on those broken branches, for whatever the reason is, the biochemistry won't fall off, or it takes a lot longer. So you'll just see this, what looks like this giant squirrel's nest, and that's what a bear nest is. Okay. Both species of brown and black bears will rub trees constantly, get parasites off just to scratch, just like humans do, as well as on logs that are on the ground. And you'll often find hair on it. And sometimes you'll even see where it's smoothed off, where they've repeatedly revisited that same tree, as an example. They also will claw and bite trees. And one of the interesting things about it is when they do that, and it makes sense when you think about it, to get their jaw around the tree, they'll turn and put their head in sort of the horizontal position and bite across the tree. Okay. And so what you'll see is these lines that are parallel to the ground. Rather than in the vertical direction, which you'll see with a different species, like let's say cat scratches. Okay, bears are oftentimes, very easy to see. It really depends on their behavior, time of the year, what they're doing. But a lot of times you can see branches moving, or a path, particularly in springtime, where they've just plowed through somewhere. Okay, but there are times when they can be very stealthy, and so you have to be careful because you can surprise them or bump into them, which is not usually a good idea, particularly if they have cubs. Okay, so you want to pay attention to what's going on around you. And I'm really going over this because if you end up trailing animals, this is the considerations you have to think about, is like the wind, right? So if you're trying to get close to an animal, typically you want to be downwind of them so they can't smell you. But in bear country, a lot of times, particularly if you're just out hiking, you'd rather actually be upwind, so that they know that you're coming, or make a lot of noise, be intentional, so that they have a chance to get away from you. Okay, and just a little bit more about bear aggression and safety. Polar bears are one of the few animals that actually will actively hunt man, and if you've had the experience of being up in their country, you'll know that. So you have to pay attention to that. Okay, in the lower 48 states and in Canada, typically brown bears or grizzly bears kind of have a bad reputation. There's a couple of exceptions to this, like the plains grizzly, but usually they'll only attack when they have cubs around. Okay, they don't actively feed on men. Black bears will sometimes in certain situations, and because of that, they molest and kill people far more than browns do. Of course, there's a lot more black bears as well, but just statistically speaking, they're more dangerous than brown bears are. Okay, and I just mentioned the plains grizzly is a more aggressive species. There's various theories about why that is, but you're only going to find those up in Alaska and Canada. Part of the reason black bears will do that is because when they get older, if they get injured or they get famished, their resources are low, then they will switch, kind of like mountain lions will, and they will take advantage occasionally. Again, it's very rare, but they will sometimes turn on people. So I'm always very cautious when I'm in bear country. And it's a good idea to carry bear spray and or a firearm. Obviously follow the laws of wherever you are. Make sure you have it licensed, etc. But that's just a good safety feature. And never, never leave food in your tent. And really, it's not a good idea to leave it in your car. In certain areas, like in the Sierras in California, there's signs everywhere, but they'll break in and destroy your car, if you leave food inside. So, keep it away, keep it out of your car, keep it away from your campsite. It's best to use a bear canister. You can't hang from a tree if you're in an area where that's allowed. If you are attacked by a black bear, wave your arms, stand up very straight. And generally, the theory is to fight back. They're very common for them to do bluff charges, but as with a lot of species, you don't want to turn and run because that invokes the predator prey response. Okay. With the brown bear, again, it's usually if cubs are involved, the old classic thing is don't fight them, lie on your stomach, play dead, cover your face and head. Okay. And even if they turn you over, just go back on your stomach and play dead. And a lot of people have survived by doing that. And if you have the misfortune of running into a polar bear, this old expression comes into play. If brown, lay down. If black, fight back. And if white, well, good night. There's just probably not a whole lot you can do unless you have a firearm. So just try to avoid that. Okay, let's jump into looking at skunk tracks now. Okay, so we're going to look at several species of skunks, starting with the striped skunk. Okay, so again, these guys look like miniature bear tracks. And I like to think of it, to me, particularly the hind track, it looks like a glove for a baby's hand. If you look at the below photo here, if you had your own kids, or you have a relative friend that has a baby around the house, you look at their hands and it's almost the same size, very similar morphologically speaking, in terms of just if they put their hand on the ground, with a couple of exceptions which we'll talk about. The hind track palm is larger to the outside, just like we were talking about with bear species. Okay, so that's just a common feature, really good ID characteristic. Both sets are slightly asymmetrical. If you drew a line down the middle and divided left from right, because the low toe one on the inside, just like with bears, is going to be, down from the rest of the toes. Okay. And that's on the front and the hinds, particularly on the hinds. We can see that in this lower photo here. Okay. That toe is much farther down than it is on the front track, right? Front track's a little closer to being symmetrical, but even on this one, it's a little hard to tell here, but this front toe is lower. These are both right feet than it is on the outer toe. Okay. And again, toe one is that inside toe. That's just the way the numbering system, we work from inside to outside. The front track has really what they refer to as prominent claws. Okay. That's because skunks are great diggers, right? But they register high above the toes, and they can be really pointed. And a lot of times they're easy to miss. You just see these small dots up above the front of the track. Okay. Whereas the hind track has shorter nails. They don't register as often as the front. And so you may not see them at all. But if they are there, they're going to be closer to the toes. So in some ways, they're easier to see in that regard because a lot of times you can miss it on a skunk because they're so far on a striped skunk. They're so far above the front foot. Another interesting feature is that the front toes 2 to 4 are fused in skunks. Okay, meaning they don't spread out, they don't splay even in deep substrate, and that's very different from other animals like deer. Okay, so they're gonna stay in line on the front track. Okay, and in the rear track, all the toes except for toe one are going to point forward, and they're in line across the top of the track, and you can really see that here in this photo. Okay, they're all next to each other and they're all almost in a line. This outside toe 5 is a little bit farther down, but for the most part, they're straight across. The front heel pad almost never registers, and the hind heel pad, and you can see it here. It's not real clear, but you can see in this photo here, and you can see a demarcation with the front pad. It is registering, and it registers a good portion of the time. Certainly not all the time, but it's not uncommon to see it. And for skunks, their preferred gait is a walk or a lope, which is what we call a group gait. It's a faster gait. And if you're a horse rider, it's similar to a canter. Okay, let's compare that now to a spotted skunk. So there's 2 species in North America of spotted skunks, the eastern and the western. Their tracks are very similar, almost impossible to distinguish, so we're going to group them together. They are definitely a smaller track than striped skunks, and they've got smaller nails. Their nails don't extend out as far from the toes as on a striped skunk, okay, on the front foot. So that's a clear differentiating feature. Again, both tracks are asymmetrical, but much more so on the hind track. And you can see that here with this low toe right here. Again, 5 toes on all skunks on the front and the hinds, just like with bears. But if I drew a line down here, we can see this toe on this front is a little bit lower than on the outside. So it's slightly asymmetrical, but not as much difference as in the hind track. Okay. The palm pads on both of them, okay, are made up of 4 distinct pads. And we can see these little circles here. And that's very different from any of the other skunk species. So as soon as you see this is when you see a clear track like this, it just screams spotted skunk. There's really nothing else. Maybe a few rodent species you could confuse it with, but it's very clear, okay? On the front track, this toe 3, which is the middle toe, we have toe 1 on the inside, then 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, toe 3 is what we call the leading toe. It's the highest toe. Okay, and then on the front track, toes 1 and 5, the outer toes are again considerably lower. Okay, on the hind track, conversely, these outer toes, which are toes 2 through 5, are mostly in line. Toe 5 is a little bit lower, but again, toe 1 is much lower. Okay. And in both the front and the hind track, again, this is a little bit different from the other species looked at, is that the toes are going to point straight up, almost entirely north. They're really not going to splay. Okay. And both sets, again, this is different from the stripe, both the front and the hind have 2 small heel pads that sometimes register, not always, but it's not uncommon to see that. Okay, and you can see that here very clearly in both of these tracks. And their preferred gait is what's called a bound, which is more like a gallop. It's a group gait or a lope. So let's switch now to a hognose skunk track. And these are pretty rare. You only find these in a few areas, really in the Southwest in the US. It's by far the biggest of the skunk tracks. Okay. They have really big toes and really big nails. Okay. And the toes are more oval shaped. They're less round. And you can see that clearly in this versus the other skunks that we looked at, the striped and the spotted. Okay. And they point straight ahead. Okay. And they're fused. They're all fused, so they're not going to splay out. They're always going to be in a line like this, close to each other. Okay. Again, very large claws. They're blunt and they register way above the toes, as you can see here, particularly on the front track. On the hind track, they're going to be closer to the toes. Okay. Again, the hind track has a low toe one, which is definitely sort of the outlier. If I drew a line from the top of toe one, you can see here that it basically ends where the other toes start. Okay. The front track is because of that low toe is almost the same. It's a little bit lower than the outside toe, but it's close. It's almost symmetrical. I'd still say it's slightly asymmetrical, but it's very close, much less asymmetrical than the hind track. And another interesting feature of hognose skunks is that the palm pad is this almost triangle shape. It's almost like canines a little bit. It's small compared to the rest of the track. The toes are huge compared to it, but it's definitely triangular shape. Whereas the heel pad is more this round arcing across the top. Okay. And excuse me, I said the heel pad, the heel track. And oftentimes, if you get a heel pad, it's going to be small and round, but it very often doesn't register. Okay. Again, the hind track palm pad is very wide in comparison. It's not that triangular shape, as I just mentioned. And like the other species, it gets larger to the outside. And it does have a heel pad that usually registers. So we can see here, not really clear, but you can see that the heel pad did register, and you can see how it's separated here from the palm pad. Okay, so very much like a bear track. And their preferred gait is an overstep walk where the hind foot lands in front of the front foot. Okay, let's look now at the hooded skunk track. Okay, so again, this is an unusual track, not very common in North America. And in the South here, we can find them, but in most places, you're not going to see it. Okay, and so it's very similar to the striped skunk. Okay, it's the most similar that you have to them. It's going to have an asymmetrical toe on the front and the hinds. It's lower down. Okay. Again, it has prominent claws on the front track, like the striped skunk, that register well above the toes. Okay. The hind track is going to have, again, less prominent nail marks, as with all the other skunk species. And the toes are going to be fused together. Okay. So they're not going to splay if you see it in deep mud. Again, toes 2 through 4 in the hind track are going to be across the top here, almost in a line, not quite. And you're rarely going to have a heel pad in the front register. Very unusual. Again, in the hind heel pad, it usually registers, but oftentimes it has a little notch in it, which you can kind of see here. Okay, this sort of notch right here. And their preferred gait is an overstep walk or a lope. Okay, so now let's switch now to a different group, Procyonidae tracks. Okay, and these again are your raccoons, your coatis, and your ringtails. Okay, and again, I'm grouping all these together because they're all in the same family, and there's a lot of similarities between them. So let's look at raccoon track. And raccoons, if you had to pick one track besides maybe deer, in terms of just to start with, they're a great one to pick because they're almost ubiquitous, right, throughout North America. So they're very common, as well as being everywhere. There's a lot of them. They inhabit all kinds of ecological habitats, I should say. So near streams, in forests. They'll go out in the open looking for food. So very easy to find their tracks, and they're slightly asymmetrical. with toe one being again the lowest on both the front and the hind. Again, on the front, it's a little closer. As you can see here, this toe one is just a little bit lower than the outer toe, but on the hind, it's far lower. So again, very similar to the other species that we've looked at, bears and skunks, okay? The hind track is going to be a little larger, again, because of this heel pad that registers. Again, one of the differences between raccoon tracks is that they do have nails and claws, and they may or may not register, but they're going to be tapered, and typically they're going to register very close to the actual toes. And you can see a little bitty nail mark here on this one, on this front track, on the outer toe, toe 5, but they don't always show up. Sometimes they are just little pinpricks like this one here, but they're not going to be way above the toes on the front track like some of the other species. Okay. On the palm pad, you're going to see in both the front and the hind a C shape on the top or the anterior portion of the palm pad. So if I drew a line across here, it's going to have this curvature like a C, okay, very much like cats do, and that's both the front and the hind, okay. And another thing that is really different in most cases, you're going to see that the palm pad is connected to these toes, okay. You're not going to see negative space or gaps, and you're going to see these toes are more cigar shaped. Okay, so that's a very common characteristic with raccoons. Okay, and you're also going to see, particularly on the front, that the pad is larger to the outside, and you can really see that here on this one. You know, it's here on the inside, but you can see it occupies much more area on the outside. Okay, another interesting feature on the front track is that it has this negative space, which some people call a hump, but it's also kind of a C shape here, and it's really just this gap inside the pad. You won't see that on the hind pad, or excuse me, on the hind foot, but you will see it on the front foot, on the posterior edge. Okay, another difference between the front and hind is that the toes will splay a little bit more, particularly these outer toes. Whereas I look on this hind track, and these are splayed a little bit, but the hind track is just tighter, and particularly the outer toes tend to point more the vertical, particularly these front toes. So they're just pointing more north, if you will. Okay. And again, with many of these other species we've looked at, the hind pad is going to register much more reliably and is almost merged with the palm pad. And this is a good example in this photo. You really can't even make out a line of demarcation. Finally, a word of warning about raccoon tracks. And one of the reasons they're both good to look at, as I mentioned earlier, and they can be difficult, is that they're often referred to as a shapeshifter. And what I mean by that is that, particularly when you don't get a clean register, they can mimic many other species, from opossums to cats to even canines and other species. And so you have to be careful of that. And one of the ways you can differentiate them, in addition to the morphology, is by gait, because their common gait is what's referred to as a 2x2 walk. And in layman's terms, what that means is you'll see a front track right next to a hind track of the opposite side. So let's say you would have a left front track on the left, and a right hind track immediately to the right of it, side by side. And then up above, you would have a right front track on the right and a left hind track on the left. You just see these groups of 2, 2, 2. And there's a few other species that do that, but it's very unusual, and raccoons are the most common. So if you can't make out the track features, that's something to look for. Okay, let's talk about a close relative of raccoons, the coati. Again, you're only going to see these in the Southwest or in Central America. They're asymmetrical, again, if you draw a line down the middle, because of that low toe one on the inside, okay, on both the front and the hind. And the hind track is going to be larger and really blockier than any of the other tracks we've looked at. You can just see this. It's just a very blocky, almost like a rectangular shaped track, okay? Much more so on the hind than it is the front, which is more tapered, and we can kind of see that here. Okay, the front track, again, is going to have longer claws than a raccoon does, because they're better diggers, and they extend well above the toes, more like skunks would. And they're very common to see that. Can't really make them out here, but it's very common that the nails will register in coatis. Okay. The hind claws are much shorter and they may not register at all because they don't really dig with their hind feet, not nearly as much. And you can see here, the toes are more substantial or bulbous than raccoons. Okay, they're not as cigar shaped, not quite as thin, if you will, and long. So just a little bulkier. And they also splay less. And you can really note that on this front foot of this coati. Okay, the toes are not splayed like they were on the raccoon front track. Okay, they may not be connected to the palm pad. Again, in raccoons, you're almost always going to see the toes connected to the palm pad. You may not see that in coatis. Okay. Um, Again, another difference with the raccoon is that, and you can see it here, is that you'll see a heel pad often register in coatis, and you won't see that almost never in raccoons. Okay, and their preferred gait is a walk. Okay, so again, a little bit different from a raccoons that always show that 2x2. Okay, and let's finish up in this section with the ringtail. So again, a ringtail spends a lot of times in trees, but you can find their tracks on the ground. They're a really cool track when you find them. Okay, um, I'm always excited when I find them because they just look a little odd. One of the reasons is they're very asymmetrical and they have five toes on both the front and the hind feet. Okay, but toe one on the hind foot will really rarely register. So again, you get the five toes on the front, four on the hind, and that's not very common. There's only a few species that actually do that. Okay, the front track is a little larger and wider than the hind track, although it can be very confusing. So again, this is a front. The top photo here is a front track. The lower photo below is a hind track. Okay, and the palm pad is very large compared to the size of the toes. Okay, so you can actually see, particularly the size of the animal, all those toes would easily fit inside the size of the palm pad. Okay, one of the differences is that between the front and the hind is the hind palm pad is a little longer than it is wide. Okay, and you can kind of see that here. And if you go and measure it, because it really ends up here, if you got your ruler out and your field guides talk about this, it's going to be longer and is wide. And so that's one of the ways you can differentiate. Also, on the trailing edge or the posterior edge of the palm pad, you get this kind of bilobe feature. And you can really see this on this hind track with a little hump in the middle. Okay. The front heel pad rarely shows, and it actually does in this track. You can see it here, but in many cases that won't show up. And because they have these semi-retractable nails, okay, kind of like cats, they oftentimes you just won't see the nails. I rarely, if ever, see the nails on these guys. Probably the toughest thing with ringtails is it's very easy to confuse them with house cat tracks. Okay, especially because it's again on the hind, it rarely registers, and on the front sometimes it won't register, and you'll just get four toes across the top. And if you're familiar with house cat tracks, you can see it looks very similar to a small house cat. Okay, and then one of the other things you can use to identify them is they have what's known as an understep walk, meaning where the hind foot is going to land typically a little bit behind where the front foot landed. Okay, so let's finish up now with what I refer to as tree dweller tracks. Okay, and let's start with one of the most bizarre tracks. Maybe I think the most bizarre of all the mammals is a porcupine. Okay, this is a really strange looking track, and the best way that I can describe it is that the surface of the foot, and if you ever see one, and sometimes I'll stop and I see an animal on the side of the road that's been killed by a car. I don't recommend you do this. Wear gloves if you do, just in case disease got it. But if you look on the bottom of the foot, you'll see it. It's a pebbly surface. It looks like a basketball. Okay, and that obviously helps them grip, that texture. Okay, also looks a little bit just the shape of the track, this kind of oblong. If you ever seen a man of war on a beach wash up, it looks a little bit like that. Okay, and the other thing about it too is that the tracks are asymmetrical. Okay, so again, it's this kind of weird sort of oval oblong shape. and they have these very, very long claws. Okay, and they're very sharp marks that will register. You almost never see the toes, okay, because these claws extend well below the toes, and so when they're walking, you just see the nail marks on the surface, but they register way above the rest of the track, above the pad. Okay, and you can see here clearly in that photo. Okay, also you'll see the toes have a big curvature. You see with these nail marks inward towards the inside of the track. So that's how you can identify left versus right. And differentiating between the front track and the hind track is the front only has 4 toes. Toe one's not there, okay? And the palm pad gets larger to the outside. It's a little hard to tell from this particular photo, but you can see here also that the hind track is larger than the front track. And it has 5 toes. So one of them's lost here in this crack. You can see just a little bit of that registration. But you can see 5 nail marks, and they're very much curved across the top here. Okay, so that's how you can differentiate front and hind. Okay, and toe one, again, is with the vast majority of species, is on the inside of the track. So these are obviously right feet in this case. Okay. One of the other great things about a porcupine, if for some reason you can't make out the tracks, is you can look for quill marks. And it's really cool. You see these little dots, or oftentimes you'll see a drag, a tail drag in loose substrate. So it's really cool to see that. And their preferred gait is either direct register or indirect register, maybe a slight overstep where the hind lands on top of the front track. And you can see here that, again, the front and hind basically registered almost in the same space, okay, partially overlapping. Okay, let's look now at a possum tracker, opossum, the Virginia opossum to be scientifically correct, or layman's correct term, I should say. So this is actually my favorite track of sort of medium-sized mammals. It's so distinctive, but it's really bizarre looking as well. And part of that is because when you see these, particularly in bad substrate, they just kind of look like a mess, because the hind track, which is the bottom one here, will oftentimes be placed right on top of the front track. And because they're very differently shaped, you just get, it's kind of like kids doing finger painting. If you've seen that, you just get these prints, and trying to decipher it can be very, very confusing at first. But as you see this over time, it becomes very quickly recognizable. The front track has 5 toes, and they're very splayed. And you can see how they're different from a raccoon here. Very spread out, a lot of space between the toes. Okay, and the outer 2 toes, toes 1 and 5, toe 1 is the one on the inside, they're pointing almost to the horizontal, okay, or to the outside, I should say. Okay, and I like to think of it, it looks like a little cartoon sketch of a sunshine, right? If you were to draw the sun with 5 rays sticking out, with little points on the end, these are the claws. It really kind of looks like that. Okay. And it is slightly asymmetrical. Again, if we drew a line straight down the middle here, you'll see this toe 3, which is the leading toe, points a little bit to the outside. So not quite symmetrical. Okay. And again, the front track has some small nails. Sometimes you see them, sometimes you won't. Okay. But what you will see very common is this sort of horseshoe shaped pad with this hump. Again, we saw earlier on a couple other species, kind of missing in the bottom, in like raccoons. You'll see, and again, this is why it's easy to confuse the two. You'll see this sort of hump or C-shape gap in the bottom of the palm pad. Okay, very common with these guys. The hind track is a really cool track, and I think it very much looks like a human hand. If you were to, put your thumb out and then point all your fingers to the outside, and then maybe spread your index, or your pinky finger out a little bit. That's almost exactly what a possum track looks like. And that thumb obviously is what enables them to be such good tree climbers. And so you can use that. It's when you see this, you just know instantly it's a possum. Okay. And so the thumb points to the inside. So that's obviously toe 1. Okay. Obviously, in this case, the hind track, you're not going to see a nail or claw or toe 1. And you're going to see on the next 3 toes, 2 through 4, you're going to see they're almost exactly the same length, and they're in parallel. Okay. And then you're going to see that little gap between them and the fifth toe, which oftentimes will show a small claw. Okay. Again, the hind track's very asymmetrical. And one other key thing, if you don't get a good impression, this is very different from the other species we've talked about so far in raccoons, is that you'll get these really deep impressions from oftentimes the thumb, but also the palm pad. And so, in the right substrate, you can really clearly see that. And you may see a tail drag sometimes as well. And as I spoke about earlier, it's very common for them to do what's called an indirect register, sometimes even a direct register, where the hind track lands either partially on top of or entirely on top of the front track. In many cases, it's slightly beneath it, which would technically be what's called an understep walk. Okay, and finally, let's finish up with some squirrel species here. So I'm lumping fox and gray squirrels together because their anatomy or the morphology of their feet are just about identical. And depending on where you live, you can use these keys to identify them. Okay, so um, the only difference I should say is that the gray squirrel is a little bit smaller, but again, that kind of depends on individuals, and that can be really tough to tell the difference. So you want to go by, ecology or habitat and where you are, where their territories, where they predominate. Okay, so the front track is it says mostly asymmetrical, but actually I think it's really just slightly asymmetrical. Again, if we drew a line here down the middle, there's a slight curvature to the inside, but just slight, not a lot there. Okay. It's four toes, and this is with almost all rodent species, which squirrels are. You're going to have four toes on the right and five toes on the hind. Okay. And you can clearly see that here. There is a toe one on the front, but almost never registers. You might see a small dot near the heel pad sometimes, but and that's again characteristic of rodent species. But in many cases, I'm telling you, squirrels, you just won't see it. Okay. The leading toes on the front foot, in other words, the toes are at the top, are these what toes 3 and 4, because toe 1 again is on the inside, doesn't register, and then you have toes 2, 3, 4, and 5 here. Okay, so they point mostly straight ahead. It'll be a little bit splayed, with toes 2 and 5 shorter and angled more to the outside. Okay, the front palm pad is curved, and you get not quite a triangle, almost more a trapezoid shape, if you remember your geometry. Okay. You can see nails on squirrels, not all the time, depends on the substrate. Okay, and they're going to be small and sharp, and again, you may not see them at all, and same on the hind foot as well. Okay, the hind tracks are much more symmetrical. It's still slightly asymmetric. You get this curvature, but it's harder to distinguish that. And you're going to see that they have a little bit wider, larger palm pad. Okay, and the hind palm pad, it will register, but you're not going to have a heel pad show up. As you can see here in the front track, you can have these two heel pads oftentimes show up. Not always, but sometimes. You're not going to see that really in the hind track. Okay, and these toes in the middle, these three toes in the middle in the hind track, 2 through 4, are going to point almost straight ahead to the vertical, and they're also going to be much closer together than the front track. So that's how you can differentiate between them. Okay, again, toes 1 and 5 are more spread out. They point to the outside, and their preferred gait is going to be a bound, which is what's known as a group gait. Okay, occasionally you will see them walk, but squirrels will bound mostly. And again, there's another session where we'll discuss gaits in more detail. Okay, this is another track. I really love finding these guys. Okay, a rock or ground squirrel. Okay, so again, they're a rodent species. So 4 toes on the front, 5 on the back, but they're much more asymmetrical. Okay, than fox squirrels. Okay, or gray squirrels. Okay, so when you see that and you draw a line through it, you're going to see that you're going to get just more curvature and just overall more asymmetry on these guys. And these toes really kind of curve and hook. In this case, obviously towards the midline, as with the other species. So this would be a left foot. Okay. and if there is a toe one, you may see a small dot to the inside, and that may be it right here, but it's pretty rare that it registers. Okay. Um, the front toes also are going to be, I think, a little more, they're bulbous, but they're a little more pointed. Um, and again, you're going to have the fifth toe is going to be on the outside. Okay. And the because it has a front toe here, and again, this kind of different with rodents on this. This inner toe actually is going to be maybe slightly higher, this toe two. Okay. So that's something that's a little different. And that's why I go with the curvature to determine left to right, because the curvature, when you come, the top part of it is always starting to curve towards the inside of the animal. Okay. The front pad is triangular, but you'll often see these three individual pads which make it up. And you usually do get these two heel pads that show up in rock squirrels, again, substrate permitting. Okay. Um, nails, again, are you can see them here, but that's what they make kind of the toes more pointed. Okay. And so on the hind track, though, and sometimes you can see this, they will register separately from the toes, but a lot of times they kind of just join it. Um, and the hind tracks are going to be, again, also more asymmetrical than in other squirrel species. Okay. And it's going to be a larger track than the front track. Again, that's common with rodent species because you've got five toes registering. And they're also going to be a little curved to the inside, but not as much as the front track. And you can clearly see that here. Okay. Again, the palm pad is made up of these distinct separate four pads. So you can usually make that out. And again, with most rodents, you're not going to see a heel pad that shows up down there. And you're going to see also that these inner toes, 2 through 4, okay, are going to show up higher than the outer toes, toes 1 and 5. And they're going to be almost across the line, bunched together across the top. And their preferred gait is also a bound. Okay, let's just finish up here with a couple of species. So flying squirrel track, these guys are hard to see because they spend most of their time in trees, to be frank. And actually, I did a podcast last year with a cyber tracker tracking evaluator, and he told this great story. He lives up north, unlike me, and they have regular snow throughout the winter. And he actually tracked these guys, but across the canopy. He could see after a fresh snowfall where they had moved from one tree across to another. So that may be actually a better way of tracking these guys. But when you do get tracks on the ground, unfortunately, particularly even if they're in snow, they may be blurry because they have so much fur on their track. Okay. Again, the front track's going to be slightly asymmetrical like the other squirrel species. 4 toes. Toe 1 is rarely going to register. The leading toe are these inner toes on the top, toes 3 and 4, and they're going to point mostly straight ahead. 2 and 5 are going to be a little bit angled to the outside and lower down. Okay. The front pad is again curved. You can't really see here, but it's made up of 3 smaller pads and didn't really register here, but there's our 2 heel pads, which sometimes will show up with lots of negative space between them. Okay. Okay. The nails are small on the front and the hind track, so they're not really going to register very often. The hind track is, again, very slightly asymmetrical, but if you drew a line down the middle of it, it's going to mostly match up from the left to right, and it's about the same size as the front foot. Okay. Again, you'll get this arc across here, but because of the fur on there, it's hard to make out. And you're just not going to get a heel pad that typically shows up. Same with the other rodent species. And for instance, the striped skunk, you're going to get, spotted skunk, you're going to get toes 2 through 4 in a line across here. Okay. And they're bunched together. Okay. So it's very common with a lot of these species. And again, toes 1 and 5 in the hind track are going to be angled to the outside and registered lower. And their preferred gait is, again, a bound and sometimes a hop, actually. And again, with the flying squirrel, there's a southern species which does more of the bound. The northern does more of the hop, but in terms of their actual tracks, they're all almost identical. Okay, so let's finish up here at the chipmunk track. Okay, again, they spend a lot more time on the ground, so Again, they're a rodent species. Their front track, again, is going to be slightly asymmetrical. Four toes, you get a little bit of curvature to the inside. Again, if I, were to draw from the bottom, from the heel here up through the top, when I come out the top, it's going to tend to curve towards the midline of the animal. Not going to usually get a toe one that registers. The inner toes 3 and 4 are going to be the leading toes, and they're going to point mostly north. And toes 2 and 5 are going to be angled to the outside. And you can really see the difference there between those. Okay. Again, you're going to get this kind of trapezoidal shaped, maybe a little bit triangular, but I think it's more of a trapezoid palm pad here. And again, you can see 3 distinct pads. This one across the top and 2 here. And you oftentimes will get, like with squirrel species, you'll get the heel pads that show up behind it. Okay. Again, they have on both the front and hind small, sharp nails. And they did actually register here, as you can see in this front track. But most cases, you're not going to see those. The hind track is more symmetrical, and it's actually quite a bit larger than the front track. Okay. And you can see across the palm pad here, a really nice arc. Okay. You can see that here. And so that's a very distinguishing feature versus that trapezoidal shape that you get in the front track. Okay. Fur covers most of the heel pads, so that's just not going to show up, typically speaking. You have the typical toes 2 through 4, which point, north and are pretty close together and form this line across the top with maybe a slight curvature to the inside of the track. Okay. One of the differences is in the hind track, you just get this slightly angled, again, the outer toes 1 and 5. They do register lower down on the track, but not as much as in other species. Okay. And their preferred gait is a bound. And a bound is when the hind feet land in front of the front feet. Okay. It's called a group gait. You'll see a set of 4. And the lower part, the first 2 tracks you come across, if you're kind of walking behind or following the trail of the animal, you'll come across the front feet, and then above that, you'll see 2 hind feet. Okay. So let's just talk about some sign and behaviors for squirrel species. So their scat is going to be a clump of pellets. It's kind of similar to when you see deer. Okay. They may be a little bit twisted. Sometimes they're connected, almost strung together, and they have little tapered ends. You will find them on the ground, but a lot of times on raised surfaces and in like nooks and crannies of trees. Okay. Obviously, tree squirrels are typically active during the daylight, and you're not going to see them really out at nighttime. And we talked about bear nests earlier. Well, they make nests also out of ball of leaves and twigs, but they're going to be much smaller. And, sometimes they're easy to confuse. Sometimes people even confuse them with hawk nests, right? Because, they're definitely bigger than bird nests, but not nearly as big as a bear nest, okay? Ground squirrels obviously spend their time on the ground, and they're burrowing animals, so they always have a safe place to go into. In terms of their feeding sign, you're going to see oftentimes evidence of masting and grass seeds and caches. They'll move nuts and acorns from one area to another and then work on shells or husks or whatever. Right now where I live, we have pecans, which are coming into season. Acorns, particularly pecans, you'll see them, a lot of times they'll remove them up in the tree and then they'll feed partially on them and drop them to the ground. And you can see the little rodent teeth marks on them. A lot of times they only eat part of them. So very easy to find evidence of these guys. You'll also see commonly when they're feeding and browsing, you'll see cuts on stems and twigs and little leafy shoots, and particularly in springtime up in the trees. When you have the new twigs and new buds coming out, they'll constantly cut those. And a lot of times, actually, you'll see them cut them. They'll eat them, but a lot of times they'll cut them, drop them on the ground, and then they'll, come back and eat them later. Okay, so it looks like a big mess for a while, but that's a very common a squirrel sign. Again, if you have fruit or pine cones or nuts, they'll eat those on the ground and, leave a lot of remains. Very common to see a big mess. And they also, a lot of people don't realize this, but they also feed on cambium. So they will do some what's referred to as barking, debarking to get to that inner bark of trees and feed on that, as well as they'll tap trees. Okay, they'll get the sap and almost certainly looking for the sugar content content of trees as well. So squirrels, a lot of people think about them as being, really just vegetarian, but that's not actually true. They will, like a lot of rodent species, they have a varied diet, and they can be omnivores. They'll feed on remains of deceased animals, as well as actually they will predate on eggs of birds, insects, snakes as well, and either other rodents. So, in a nutshell, sorry for the pun, but they're opportunists. Okay, so lots of feeding sign, and if you're just looking at kind of all around animal that's convenient to study their behavior, they're easy to see, how they eat. Their sign as well as their tracks are actually a really good animal to start with, okay, because they're just all arounders, if you will.